Shalom. It's really good to be here and an honor to have been asked. I want to thank Father Bozek. I told him when I came in I can't even believe it, but I've never been to St. Stanislaus until today. Father Bozek and I have known each other for a long time. We've done a number of weddings together. We make a pretty good team, so if anyone is looking for a priest and a rabbi to officiate a wedding, you might want to consider us. So I actually wasn't planning on telling this story, but I was inspired by the readings of the letter that Dr. King wrote from, the famous letter that Dr. King wrote from the jail. This is another story about Dr. King and jail, and of course that wasn't the only time he spent in prison for the simple act of standing up for civil rights and for justice. But this has to do with St. Louis, and it also has to do with the Jewish community. And so in the late 50s, so very early on in Dr. King's career in civil rights and his beginnings as an agitator, as someone who was a change maker, Dr. King was invited by Rabbi Jerry Groman of blessed memory, who was the rabbi at the time of United Hebrew Congregation, which was on Skinker right across from Forest Park. And Rabbi Groman asked Martin Luther King if he would come and speak at the synagogue. Of course, people had started to hear about Martin Luther King and the civil rights movement in the South, but he had not spoken in St. Louis to such a large congregation. And Dr. King accepted the invitation, but was arrested while participating and leading civil disobedience somewhere in the South just before he was supposed to come to St. Louis. On the day of the evening of the speech, Dr. King was released from jail and he came to St. Louis. And he went to United Hebrew Congregation with the people he was traveling with, and he met Rabbi Groman. And there was a few hours left before the speech. And Dr. King said he was very tired. He had spent the last couple nights in jail. And was there a place that he could rest? And Rabbi Groman led Martin Luther King into his study, and Martin Luther King sat down in Rabbi Groman's chair to rest. And when Rabbi Groman kind of looked in on him, he was fast asleep, Dr. King was. And he woke up and did the speech, and it was quite a moment in St. Louis history and St. Louis Jewish history. But Rabbi Groman never again sat in that chair. He kept that chair as testimony to the visit of a great man and a great moment, and that chair is now in the St. Louis Historical Society Museum. And Rabbi Groman, until he passed away a couple of years ago, would tell that story over and over and over again. And actually, a few years later, Rabbi Groman went to the March on Washington in 1963, where Dr. King delivered his famous I Have a Dream speech. So I wanted to relay that story on this day, this Dr. Martin Luther King Day, which to me is an amazing celebration for a couple of reasons. To me, this is one of those holidays, holy days, that is both a secular observance and a religious holiday. Of course it's secular. All Americans should observe Martin Luther King Day the way that you're doing right now, some way to, as the Father reminded us, recommit ourselves to justice. Doesn't matter your belief, your tradition, whatever path you come on, if you are American, this is a holiday. This is a sacred day. This is a day that reminds us of who we ought to be, of a great man who made great change in this country. But for those of us who are religious in some way, shape, or form, this is also a holy day, because Martin Luther King Day reminds us of some of the great religious themes: transformation and hope and justice. And Dr. King had an amazing way of speaking and inserting religious language into a civil conversation. Martin Luther King never seemed too secular or too religious. Somehow he was able to walk that balance. And so this becomes, for me as a Jew, a holy day on my calendar, Martin Luther King Day. And I, collect the buttons and I march and I participate in any way that I can. And I'll never forget the King Day of 2009. I was blessed enough to be in Washington, D.C., and that was, of course, the day before President Barack Obama became inaugurated as our president. I have to tell you, to be at that moment in Washington, D.C., on Martin Luther King Day, awaiting that inauguration, made me feel that we had nowhere to go but up, that we had completed some kind of work that had been so long in coming. Racial justice, racial equality, the first African American president elected. It was a high point. But now we have this Martin Luther King Day. This Martin Luther King Day that comes after the killing of Michael Brown. This Martin Luther King Day after Ferguson has shown us that we still have a long way to go, that there is still racial bias, and that there is still despair, and that there is still injustice. We knew it all along, but boy, do we know it now. And so Black Lives Matter becomes the rallying cry that we thought we had already succeeded in reminding ourselves, reminding our nation. But we can't give up, and we must recommit ourselves, and we must understand that there is much more to be done. As much as we were on the mountaintop a few years ago, we still have to climb higher. And so in our tradition, we have a prayer. And it comes from the Torah, the part of the Torah that Dr. King talked about all the time, the exodus of the Hebrew slaves from Egypt. And the prayer that's excerpted from the Torah tells that moment of exaltation when the slaves were finally freed. And we sing a freedom song. But of course, those slaves were freed. We are free people. So why do we sing that song at every service? It's so we should never forget. It's because until all people are free, we're really not free. That freedom song reminds us that as much as we had cause to celebrate when we crossed that sea, we weren't done yet. And so my challenge is, our closing song, I understand, is "We Shall Overcome." That's the prayer for Martin Luther King Day. That's the moment that we should stand up and say, as far as we've come, we still need to overcome. So take that song as a reminder, as a charge, as an inspiration to never give up, to celebrate the successes, but also to know that there is so much more work to be done. And I really, really, truly want to thank all of you for making this a day on and not a day off, and wish you a blessed and holy and sacred holiday to honor Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Thank you.